The full-scale Russia's war against Ukraine is not only killing people and destroying lives, it's also transforming Ukraine's cities. Today I'm speaking with Semen Shirochin, a specialist in Ukrainian architecture and the author of numerous books on this subject. We'll talk about what exactly is happening to Ukraine's architectural heritage, which places are under the greatest threat, and what can still be protected and restored. Simon, first of all, thank you so much for joining me today. So when we talk about Russia's war against Ukraine, we usually focus on human losses and the number of victims. But there are another kinds of damage that often stay a little bit in the shadows: environmental, economic, and architectural. From your perspective, from your point of view, how deadly has this war been for Ukrainian architecture?
First of all, thank you for inviting me to this talk. And regarding the architecture, I completely agree with you because it's really in the shadow of human losses, and the architecture itself is sometimes in the shadow of the function of the building. For example, when the power plant is lost, everybody is speaking about the loss of energy source, the loss of infrastructure, but nobody is speaking about power plants as about architecture. And this is just a simple example. If you speak about numbers, they're growing fast and they're huge. First, when I tried to find the answer on the question how many buildings are destroyed in total, I found the number of 200,000. Since then, this number has increased. And the last time when I was just checking this number, one of the articles, it became outdated. And the actual number is about 300,000 buildings. There's all the types of buildings in different regions and different typology and of different architectural value. So these numbers include like mass housing, rural housing, industry, and of course some unique and very valuable objects.
So we can say that almost every day something valuable from the architectural point of view is being destroyed in Ukraine.
Problem is that we don't have all the information about it. And that especially in the front line, where we really don't know what's happening. And on the occupied territories, when we don't have much information from, some cities are now made as the advertisement for Russian occupation administration, like Mariupol. So there is information about the buildings that are being reconstructed there after they've been damaged.
Like a theater, for example.
Yes, like theater. So it's a good example. That's when it becomes part of the propaganda. But at the same time, we don't know what happened to many theaters and places of culture, hotels, residential buildings, museums in different cities. And there were many valuable buildings. And the greatest problem is that we really don't know much about them, not only about their condition, but even about them, because the heritage of many Ukrainian cities is not very famous. It's not wide known. And the great tragedy is that this architecture is being lost before it's recognized as valuable.
Although I think some buildings, because I know from the news, some of the buildings, I know something about Ukraine because I lived in Ukraine, of course, but I haven't visited every city, every town, so I don't know much about Ukraine's architecture, I would say. And sometimes I know from the news that something was destroyed in such and such town, and it was built many years ago, but by some very well-known international European, for example, architect. And these are the facts we know just now during the war. As you said, we didn't know that before.
Yes, the problem is that actually most Ukrainians don't travel inside Ukraine. Most people don't know there's anything valuable except of some most famous cities and objects, and most people prefer to travel abroad. But the fact is that there are many really interesting buildings with history and made by famous architects, but we don't know their names. We don't know this history, and that's why we don't know the value. And even me, though I'm interested in architecture and traveled across Ukraine for about 20 years, many places were a surprise. So I didn't know about them. And some of them were really hard to get because of the condition of roads or the infrastructure, because sometimes there's no good train connection to that point. So the problem was that they were not so easy to reach. And there were no any street signs showing where to go, like it is in many popular places where there are many tourists. There are signs where to go. For example, when you're in Venice, you in every part of Venice, you see a sign showing you how to get to Rialto Bridge because it's the center of the city.
Right.
And the things like this don't exist in many Ukrainian cities and towns. And most of architectural gems are really unknown. So they are mostly known by locals who see them every day, or some specialist researchers who know about these buildings because they write something about this building, so they make some photos of these buildings. But the wide audience usually, unfortunately, knows about buildings from the front line when they're lost. So there's news that some museum is destroyed, and most people have never been to that museum, and they even didn't know this museum exists.
And especially
But
international audience.
And even more, because international audience knows even less about Ukraine, unfortunately, because if you don't speak about yourself, nobody will know. And the great problem is that the foreign audience doesn't have an image of what is Ukrainian architecture and how rich is the heritage and how different is the heritage and how diverse is the heritage.
As for geography, which regions or cities have suffered the most if we look specifically at the destruction of architectural heritage and historical buildings?
First of all, the front line, the east and southeast of Ukraine, where the most territories where active war happens, they're most damaged. But actually, we need to remember that there is no safe place across Ukraine because cruise missiles can reach anything and any place. And even if some object is not a military target, it can be hit because the missile, if the missile is shot, it falls down and it can fall down anywhere. So anything can become damaged and destroyed by the attacks. But of course, the cities at the front line, they are suffering much heavier losses because they're placed of constant fighting. They're reached by architecture. They're reached by the architecture is reached by artillery, even from Russian side if it's the city on the border. So that's why the Eastern Ukraine, that's in my opinion, is less known, is suffering the most. And unfortunately, many buildings that have not yet become tourist attractions are already destroyed in this war.
Can you give us a couple of examples of the architectural gems in Ukraine that were destroyed during this war, except Kharkiv? Because I will ask you to not to touch Kharkiv because I want to talk to Kharkiv separately.
Of course, the first thing that comes to my mind is Mariupol because the city suffered a lot, and but the city is somehow lucky because it became the center that propaganda is focused on. That's why they spend a lot of money for reconstruction of buildings. The separate question is the quality of that reconstruction, because I see that many buildings are built with much less attention to the details, and I see the difference between the buildings that were there before and that are now. And sometimes the buildings are demolished for new construction, and that's what's happening everywhere. But of course, there were many buildings that were destroyed in Mariupol, including the monumental art. And although they, for example, have rebuilt the railway station, the famous mosaics that were there inside were lost. They were not rebuilt. And of course, there are many losses in the city of Bakhmut that was a rich merchant city that existed even earlier than many industrial cities that appeared only in the late 19th century. So there were many buildings that were built by rich merchants, And the central square that first has suffered in the Second World War, and now it suffered again. And the famous Palace of Culture that is in the central square of Bakhmut is really now standing in ruins, and the buildings of all the square there. And some of the buildings really were very interesting. They represented different architectural styles of 20th century, including the Art Nouveau and interwar architecture that's very interesting, the functionalist architecture, and many things that we don't know, unfortunately, yet about and that are already lost. There are many small cities with their own architectural gems. For example, Liman is the city of railroad workers, and they had a very beautiful and unique building from 1920s that was the Palace of Culture for Railroad Workers. And as I know, this building now is burned, the same as the Palace of Culture in Mirnograd. That was one of the few that were built in late 20s. Most people don't know that there was active cultural construction of palaces of culture as workers' clubs in 1920s, and many of them were built there. And after Second World War, many of them were rebuilt because they were damaged, and they changed their appearance, they changed the style. But Mirnograd had one of the few that remained in its original appearance. And as I saw the recent pictures from the city, it is now also in ruins. So unfortunately, many buildings, I will say it once again, that many buildings are now destroyed, and we even didn't know about them, about their value. And that would be a problem in the future, because if we compare Notre Dame de Paris, everybody knew it was suffered from fire. Everybody understood that they need to fix everything and make it as was before the fire. So when the building is recognized, it's some way of protection for this building. But when nobody knows about it, nobody will say a word that we need to bring it back because it's something valuable, it's part of our identity, and so on. And of course, there are many other examples around Ukraine, some old railroad stations, big buildings, palaces of culture. The railway station in Konstantinovka was one of those beautiful buildings that was destroyed. And unfortunately, I would say that when I have the picture of the list of buildings that are damaged or lost, it's always outdated because I don't have enough information. Because when I try to research, at the moment, the information is already outdated, and maybe in a week, something becomes destroyed, something new becomes destroyed. So all around the front line, mostly in the region of Donbass, we have this problem that heritage has disappeared, and we even don't know if something remains there.
I have already mentioned Kharkiv, and I want to talk about the city. And the city, we know that it's on the news. I think international audience know this name because this city is suffering a lot from the Russia's attacks, and there was a recent attack during holidays. So actually, very few people around the world understand how valuable Kharkiv is in architectural terms, even though it was the capital of Ukraine from 1919 to 1934. How would you explain to an international audience what makes Kharkiv unique from an architectural point of view? I heard that some experts would compare it to Chicago in the US.
Well, I would say that the city is really has a unique slice of heritage from early 20th century, and especially 1920s and also 1930s. As you have already mentioned, because it was the capital of Soviet Ukraine, and it was a very interesting time when it was the capital. It was a time when there was a stylistic pluralism, when different architectural styles could coexist, and when architecture was not yet part of politics, when the architectural style was not perceived as loyal to the regime or not. And at that time, especially in Kharkiv, in 1920s, you could see the building that had the elements from Art Nouveau. You can find buildings that represent neoclassical architecture. You can find buildings that have some elements of neo-baroque. You can find even a building on the Red Banker building that was built in 1928 that has even some Gothic elements. And it was Gothic elements in the building in socialist time. That's very unique. And at the same time, you can meet the one of the most famous buildings from constructivist style. For example, the building of state industry. That's maybe the most famous building of the city, and there were talks about including it to UNESCO list. It's known as the horizontal skyscraper. It's very huge, and it consists of many blocks connected with sky bridges. So it's really very, very famous, very unique, and it's one of the buildings that were damaged because I remember that there were at least 2 attacks when it was damaged. And one of them just lost some of the windows, but the other one was a hit at the building itself. Recently, I was told by some person who lives there that in the city center you will not find a building that wasn't damaged. At least some windows were cracked, but some buildings suffer heavy damage because they were hit by missiles or by artillery, because Russia is very near, and the problem is that all the weapons used against the city reach it very fast, and you cannot do anything with that. So it's unfortunately many available buildings are damaged, and sometimes I see that they are demolished before the question, if the question is raised about their reconstruction, about their value, just because of their poor condition. And I saw at least several buildings were demolished because they were afraid that they could collapse, but instead of trying to help them, they were demolished. So I use the phrase that you should treat a damaged building like a wounded person. You should help it survive, not to try to make its death quicker.
But I guess, unfortunately, it's probably not because the authorities don't want to save it, but just because they don't have the resources, financial resources and time resources during the war, even to think about how to save it. I don't know what can be the decision in this situation.
The question is that, first of all, local authorities are not experts in architecture, but they pretend to be. And they even don't ask the expert's opinion about the buildings. Many of them see destruction as a chance for new construction. And they have a conflict of interest because developers want to use war as a benefit, as some new spaces become free because the buildings are demolished, they are destroyed by war, and a new spot of land in the city center is free for new construction. And that's why there were several cases when local authorities said that we'll build something new and very fashionable instead of this old building. And only after some scandals, the discussion starts, especially when the Kharkiv administration was hit. I remember that the first talks were about we will build something new on the spot. But then the architects that I know started to show an alternative opinion that the building is valuable. It's a historic building. It was built by famous architects, and that it should be kept, it should be restored as it was. And actually, I wouldn't say that it's so much damage that can be restored. So the most problem is the lack of understanding of the value of the building. And of course, the other problem is the lack of protection status. So if the building is officially recognized as an architectural landmark, if it's a protected monument, then if it's damaged, it is enlisted to the list of Ministry of Culture. And the process of its reconstruction is happening by the Ministry of Culture. But if it's not enlisted, Ministry of Culture doesn't care. It doesn't have any responsibility for the building. And that's why many valuable buildings, they are demolished just because they are not protected. And they are not protected not because they're not valuable, but because it's a process that takes time. You need to do a specific research on specific building. You need to find some expert that will sign this conclusion. You need to make some analysis to find some materials in archives, to find the name of the author, years of construction, and of course, the building has to follow some of the criteria to be included in the protection list. So this all takes time, and it's a long process. And unfortunately, many valuable buildings are not included in the protection list. And this is one of the key problems that that we see now in different places. For example, in the city of Zaporizhia, there are two buildings on the same avenue, and both were built in 1950s, and one of them was recognized as architectural monument. And after it was damaged, the damaged section was replaced with the architectural details that were lost. It's a unique and good example. We don't have many of them. And the other building that didn't have protection status was hit by a missile, but it was reconstructed without recreation of any architectural details, just because
So we
it
can
wasn't
say
recognized as a monument.
so we can say that it's the war plus some problems that already existed before in this area.
Yes, the problem is that if all those buildings were protected, if there was no conflict of interest in city administration and local developments, because construction business always wants to replace existing buildings with their new ones. So if we didn't have those problems, then war damage would be somehow reversible. We could say that the valuable building will be rebuilt as it was, like it was with Notre Dame de Paris. If it's damaged, we can be sure that it will be rebuilt exactly as it was. So this damage is not a loss. But the great problem is that with all those previous problems, the problem of war makes it even harder to protect the buildings. Also, we have not just a lack of understanding, but we have the politicization of heritage and the interpretation of heritage as Soviet times. So if earlier we could say that this is our heritage, now it's harder to speak about it because many people say that this is something that belonged to totalitarian regime. And during the war, there is no dialogue because the dialogue existed before the war. Now it's very hard to have a dialogue about this because of this politicization of questions related with heritage.
As for the list, how is wartime damage to architecture being documented today?
Well, as I say that I found the total numbers, but I understand that the lists, for example, I understand the Ministry of Culture has its own lists. The lists of the buildings that were included and that should be protected by Ministry of Culture and that were damaged, but they don't care about all the others. I understand that there are some lists that were done by some local authorities because they're responsible for buildings as a property. And also there are some lists that are created by enthusiasts, by activists, but none of them is complete. And there's no single list where you could see each building, each address, the pictures before and after, and all the data. And problem that we don't have a database like that. I tried to create my own one as part of the project to destroy Ukrainian heritage, but for example, they said that bring the 40 or 50 most famous examples that will show the diversity of geography, of architectural styles, of topologies, and so on. But it takes time to find information on each building and to find its exact location. The other problem is that we are not told about the losses because it is not allowed to take pictures of something damaged by war because it's considered that you're helping the enemy to know that the missile has reached its target. So this is another problem that we are usually not told what is lost. So only after these pictures are published by some officials, we get this information and it's allowed to speak about it. So that's why the spread of information about this is very limited. And because of this restriction, I would say that I know less and less, because information that I get is mostly from the news. And that's why there's a problem with this documentation. I understand that there's already some work happening about um, making the lists of the buildings that were damaged, and some of them are already trying to be fixed, especially the residential ones, because people need to live somewhere. And of course, the mass housing, if it's not too damaged, they're trying to rebuild it, especially in Kharkiv. I know that some of the prefabricated panel buildings, they were somehow rebuilt since 2022 when they were damaged. But at the same time, I see that some buildings that are especially valuable in the city center, when they are damaged and they are not rebuilt, it looks like this is related with some plans to build something new on the spot.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we saw in Kiev, with one of the first buildings that was damaged by a Russian drone. It was October 2022. I remember that because the noise was heard all around the city, and the building was partly destroyed, but the remaining inhabitants wanted to fix it. The activists tried to find information. Some designers even prepared the design of the building, and some restorators from Poland offered their help, but the city administration decided that this building is too damaged to be rebuilt, and it still stands as ruins, although at the moment when we speak, it could have been already rebuilt and people could come back to their homes. So there are some examples when it could be better, when it could be different. And unfortunately, we have many of the examples like that, because many buildings are standing in ruins, they're standing damaged, and we don't know what will happen to them later.
So this is one of the main risks of not restoring the certain buildings, certain monuments, that the authorities might build something new on that place and never restore them.
Yes, yes. So one of the risks is that anything can be damaged, and the other risk is that the risk of not being rebuilt, the risk of being demolished, even despite the public opinion, despite the architectural value, despite that people offer their help for that, because there is commercial interest in new construction. And this is the risk that I see in several places. This was in Kiev, this was in Kharkiv, I saw this in Vinnytsia when one of the buildings was damaged. The city authorities said that we will build a new mall on the spot of this palace of culture. But then when people said that it's officially recognized as an architectural monument, you cannot do that. Only when this information was found that actually the building is the monument, they changed their mind. But if it wasn't protected, I think that they would come up with this decision to build a mall instead. So this is really a problem, that the architecture is very fragile, and as it's not only the walls are fragile, but also the value in public opinion is something fragile. So you cannot be sure that there would be some activity to change public opinion to protect the building if nobody knows about the value, like we have it in many times, unfortunately.
Do international organizations help in monitoring and protecting Ukraine's cultural heritage?
Well, I know that UNESCO had published some statements that's very worried about that Ukraine has several UNESCO objects, the city centers of Lviv, Odessa, and a few objects in Kiev and so on. But what can UNESCO do? Is just to say that they're worried that there are some UNESCO objects that can be damaged by war, and that is bad. But actually, I never heard about international organizations that could help, that could prevent something. They couldn't do anything with Taliban. Taliban was destroying Buddhist statues. They can do anything in other regional conflicts. So all they can do is that they can help with funding its reconstruction after the war, like it happened, for example, in Mostar, when during the Balkan Wars, the famous bridge was destroyed, and this bridge was enlisted in UNESCO. So after the war, it was restored exactly as it was, and this is a good example. But to make this thing happen, you need to have a UNESCO enlisted object. And the problem is that in Ukraine, we have only a few of them.
You have already talked a little bit about public opinion. How present is the topic of damage to architectural and cultural heritage in Ukrainian public discussions today? How is it relevant? Do people talk about that?
The problem is that when you start talking about the architectural laws, people can say that you don't care about human lives. This is what can happen. Because, of course, the first priority is human lives. And when you say that I care about architecture first, some people would not understand. And this is one of the problems. But in the communities of heritage protection activists and among the professionals and architects, there are talks about that. But of course, we understand that this is not a priority for the state at the moment. And I understand that also some of the architects, they also understand that they could become the possible authors of something new instead of the buildings that are damaged now. So there is a conflict of interest even in the architectural professional community. Although some of them try to protect the buildings, try to change the public opinion, the others understand that they can have benefits from this process, as many people expect that there will be a lot of funds for reconstruction, and they expect to have many new projects related with that. And this conflict of interest that is one of the problems for preservation and reconstruction of the damaged buildings, because some people think that it's better to build something new instead of the old and damaged building. And of course, this is not a focus during the war because there are very many other problems. And I heard from several people who are also interested in architecture that we also understand it, but we understand that if we speak about this in public, people would say that you don't care about human lives. And as people are very emotional during the war, you will not be heard. And if you try to insist that this is important, it wouldn't work. People wouldn't hear you, and moreover, they would say that we shouldn't care about this. So this is also a problem, that you cannot somehow force public opinion to change, because the public opinion is focused on other things. People are focused on survival.
Understandably, yeah. But I think internationally there is a discourse that, it's very important to talk about Ukrainian literature, and people around the world know more about Ukrainian literature now, and about, I don't know, Ukrainian poetry, Ukrainian culture in general, and I
But
think
culture in
architecture
general
as well.
culture is generally something movable. Architecture is something that is not movable. And that's why when we speak about museums, collections, literature, this all can be evacuated, but buildings cannot. And this is the problem, that architecture is something that belongs to the place, and it stays in the place. And that's why architecture, I would say that it's the most fragile type of art, because it's vulnerable and it can be moved. And of course, as we already spoke in the beginning of our talk, people usually know nothing about the architecture. And of course, Ukrainians can tell foreigners about their culture, but they can tell only what they know. And the problem is that the architectural heritage is not widely known. That's why it's even less known abroad.
Thank you for joining this conversation with Semen Shirochin about Ukrainian architecture in a time of war. These stories remind us that the outcome of this war will be measured not only in territory, but also in what survives of Ukraine's cultural and historical identity. If this discussion helped you see the war from a new angle, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it so that more people hear about what is happening to Ukraine right now. Your support really helps keep these conversations going.